You're listening to Big World Network.
Cherubim, Episode 1, written and read by Philip Skousen. Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. Death stood silent and stagnant at the bottom of a broad valley some 1,300 feet below the distant surface of the Mediterranean Sea. It was dusk. Although miles away, the huge body of stagnant salt water caused massive updrafts during the late afternoon heat, flinging dusty debris high into the hazy sunset. The haze obliterated the beginnings of the early evening stars and yellowed the rising moon. The Roman legionnaire stood at his post, poised by the edge of a false plateau, a sizable flat step between two outcroppings of cliffs. He had drawn the assignment to guard the left flank of his small camp, which lay a half-league to the south. True to his training, his right hand firmly gripped the hilt of his sheathed battle sword. His calloused left hand held the sturdy oak shaft of his spear. The heavy forged iron head pointed toward the evening sky. From beneath his helmet of leather and bronze, his vigilance scanned the rocky base of the cliff, and then across the plains to the darkening Dead Sea. A ribbon of silvery light indicated the River Jordan, next to which sat the Legion's main encampment. Behind the Legionnaire, a league away, rose up the dark shadows of a massive wall of even higher cliffs. The false plateau which separated the two cliff structures contained a narrow road that connected a string of small, impoverished villages. When it was daylight, occasional foot traffic or even a donkey-drawn cart could be observed from the Legionnaire's post. To maintain mental sharpness against the monotony of the approaching night duty, the guard muttered the Legion's motto: "To protect my comrades is honor. To defend my comrades is duty." He knew if his mind wandered, even for a moment, he and his comrades could pay a difficult price. In the past year, his 8-man Cherubim had lost 2 excellent soldiers to surprise night attacks, and with that angry recollection, he hardened his grip on his heavy lance. He turned around to scan the sharp cliffs rising high above him, but the swirling wind carried sand that stung his eyes. Defensively, he turned away and again faced east, keeping his back to the western mountains and the darkening red sunset. A small whirlwind twisted by and enveloped the sentry in a cloud of dust. Flying sand and twigs rattled against his brass breastplate, stinging his bare arms and hands. Instinctively, he reached up with his left hand to shield his eyes. As he touched a finger to his eye to wipe away the fine grit, a massive pair of hands gripped his neck. With a sudden jerk, the hands tried to pull him to the ground. The Roman dropped the lance, and with his 2 hands struggled violently against the chokehold, kicking and thrashing about in an attempt to free himself. The Legionnaire was strong, but his attacker possessed even greater strength. After seconds of muffled grappling, the Roman frantically feared he was not powerful enough to pry the iron grip from the choking embrace. His lungs burned for want of fresh air, and his constricted throat only produced a gagging squawk. The adrenaline coursing through his brain focused only on one thought: the Pugio. His hands jerked away from the chokehold and madly searched for his large leather belt where he carried the deadly knife. His hands grazed a sliver of cool metal, and his hand closed around the leather-banded hilt. He yanked out the poisoned dagger, a compact yet lethal instrument legionnaires carried as an additional safeguard against treachery. His arm swung the dagger in a wide arc, but the attacker saw it and stepped back to keep his leg away from the danger. The blade found only air. The legionnaire twisted to one side, desperately hoping for a better target for the knife. A muffled yet urgent cry of warning came from another quarter. Out of the darkness darted another cloaked figure. Rather than pull his short sword from its leather scabbard, the second attacker reached for the Roman's fallen lance and placed the sharp iron point against the withering soldier's side. Putting the full weight of his body behind the weapon, he savagely thrust the spearhead into the vulnerable gap between the breastplate and the backplate. The point worked its way into the Roman's midsection and found vital organs. The body went rigid, then limp. Death was quick. The dagger fell from the quivering hand and landed with a dull thud in the sand. The first attacker tried to lower the body to the ground, but stumbled and lost his balance. He fell onto his back, the body atop him. Now assured of his enemy's death, he pushed the heavy weight away with a shudder, as if the lifeless form was leprous. All that could be heard was the wind and the gasping of the two attackers. The first rose to one knee to catch his breath. Finally, he looked up and extended his arm. His deliverer took the hand and helped him up. Rising up to his full height, Joshua revealed himself to be a large, barrel-chested man at least 2 spans taller than the second man, who was known as Samuel. They assessed the dead Roman before the larger man spoke. "Samuel, thanks to you, the swine is dead." A somber Samuel replied, "His death is a blessing, Joshua. My thrust was guided by Jehovah." He leaned over and spit unceremoniously on the crumpled body before whistling a soft bird call. Moments later, 5 shadows emerged silently from the darkness. They too wore dark, rough woolen robes similar to those worn by Samuel and Joshua. Each man's step was staggered by a heavy load. One carried a bundle of spears, while the others had earthen pots hoisted upon their shoulders. Each silently set his burden down by the dead Roman. They returned from the direction they had come, making 3 trips into the darkness, each time returning with more earthen pots or weapons, including a large collection of arrows, spears, and swords. Although dusk was nearly complete, the faint light held as the moon showed its full face from the eastern horizon. The wind began to die with the loss of the sun, and an eerie silence replaced it. Samuel grabbed one man's arm and nodded to the dead Roman. "Saul, take Daniel and bury the Roman. Add the spear to ours, but bury that cowardly knife with him. We have no need of it." Each man reached down to grab an arm and dragged the heavy body to a small clearing where the soft sand seemed particularly deep. They dropped to their knees and began to scoop out a small depression. The other men stood around in a tight circle, watching Samuel stroke his dark, full beard. As was customary for those Hebrews holding high religious positions, the beard was parted at the chin. He twisted the right side of his beard in thought, then turned and faced a shadow. "Aaron, we're watching the Roman post?" "I sent Jonas," Aaron replied. Jonas was the youngest of the party and the fleetest. If any Roman left the encampment, his task was to immediately forewarn Samuel and the others. Samuel nodded his approval at the selection of Jonas, then asked, "And you've sealed each pot?" "Yes, Samuel," replied Aaron. "With the grace of Jehovah, may they last until the Messiah reigns on earth." Samuel grunted. "That is good." He nodded his approval as Saul and Daniel finished pushing sand into the shallow grave. "The time approaches," he called to the others. "Quickly now, bring the cart." The giant Joshua, along with Aaron and the 2 remaining Hebrews, disappeared into the darkness. After several minutes, the creaking sound of wood binding against wood was heard, which heralded the appearance of a farmer's 2-wheeled cart, pulled by a straining Joshua and pushed by 3 others. An hour earlier, the cart had been weighed down with weapons and pottery. But out of necessity, it had been emptied at the road, for fear the added weight could not traverse the deep sand. Finally, the men halted the cart's progress when they reached Samuel, who walked behind the cart to examine the wooden beam. Earlier that day, Joshua and Aaron had lashed a heavy, horizontal beam to the rear of the cart. The beam was long and extended the length of the cart by 5 cubits. At the far end of the beam, a crude wooden pulley swung about freely. A loop of rope connected the pulley to a coil of thick rope inside the cart. With broad hand gestures, Samuel directed the men to twist the cart around, so that the beam jutted out beyond the edge of the cliff. The cart now stood directly over the dark, damp stain in the sand. The sweetness of the spilled blood was still pungent in the evening air. Samuel put his shoulder to the corner of the cart, and with a grunt, shifted its position slightly. He then walked to the cliff's edge and eyeballed the position of the beam against an unseen point in the void below. "We're close," he said as much to himself as the others. He paused in thought, his eyes deeply shut as if in deep concentration. The others stood watching. Another vision, they thought collectively. Thank Jehovah, God still speaks to us through Samuel. They knew Samuel as a visionary man. And now God was confirming their mission. Their anxiety relaxed. Samuel's eyes flickered open. He walked to the cart, suddenly impatient. Rocks! We need rocks! Each searched in the dim light to gather large stones that lay scattered about. With grunts of exertion, they carefully laid them into the back of the cart. When the pile of stones began to strain the wooden joints, Samuel halted the task with a wave of his hand. He placed his back against the cart and tried to budge it. With the added weight, the cart was securely anchored in place. Samuel halted the work with a slash of his hand. Enough! Hurry now, Jehovah seeks our labor. His nose turned back in the direction of the nearby Roman camp, as if he could smell the unseen enemy. The sentry may be relieved soon. Once they discover he's missing, you must be far away. The thick, rough rope was uncoiled. One end was tied around Samuel's waist, while Aaron tossed the opposite end of the rope to Joshua. The giant gathered in the loose line until the pulley tightened. In response, the rope began to pull Samuel, willingly, to the cliff. At the edge, Samuel looked down into the dark void. His sharp eyes strained in the twilight to make out the faint shadows of the enormous boulders that littered the base of the cliff far below. The vertical rock wall appeared pale in the growing moonlight. A smile widened across his face as he spotted this sliver of a black shadow embedded in the cliff directly beneath the platform, about 20 cubits straight down. "Lord Jehovah is with us, I can see it," he declared to no one in particular. Without hesitation, he took hold of the beam with one hand and let his body fall into the dark void. With a yank, the rope caught him under the armpits, and he swung out beneath the pulley at the end of the beam. Joshua's powerful muscles kept the taut rope from slipping. The cart groaned under the strain of the extra weight. Finally, Samuel stopped swinging, and Joshua lowered him hand over hand slowly into the emptiness below. Taking Samuel's place by the cliff's edge, Aaron anxiously watched his leader's descent as Joshua continued his work. Aaron waved his hand, palm down, slowly, slowly. In response, Joshua continued to play out the rope. The rope's tension suddenly slackened. "He's there," announced Aaron, looking up relieved. A moment later, the limp rope was tugged once again from below, and Joshua gathered it up quickly. It was now Aaron's turn. He tied the rope around his chest, and he too launched himself into the night. A few minutes later, he joined Samuel, crouching on the slight ledge that protruded from the face of the cliff. Joshua pulled up the empty rope for a second time. The others moved quickly to secure the rope to a nearby bundle of weapons, which were then lowered to Samuel and Aaron. The moon was high in the sky by the time all the weapons found their way down the cliff. It was only then that the first pot was reverently tied to the rope, and it too descended below. 2 hours later, Aaron untied the final earthen pot from the rope and handed it to Samuel, who turned to place it next to the others in the cave. Aaron said, "This is the last one." Samuel confirmed it by setting it down and lifting the lid. The unsealed container joined 4 others by the small entrance to the cave. In the back of the cave lay a large collection of pots as well as the stacks of weapons. Aaron recounted the pots grouped at the back of the cave. "Jehovah is with us," he spoke softly. Samuel nodded as he began scooping the slimy mud out of the closest open pot. The pile of mud grew large in the corner of the cave as each pot was emptied. A bulging wood blanket appeared at the entrance. Aaron reached out to grab it and swung it into the cave. He strained against the weight while Samuel untied a thick knot. Finally released, the contents of the bundle spilled out. 24 small rocks scattered across the floor of the cave. Aaron piled them next to the mud, while the blanket floated upward toward the cart. Soon another load of rocks appeared. After 3 more trips, a large mound of rocks stood at the entrance. Samuel surveyed the mud and rocks. "Ready?" Aaron nodded. "Yes, Samuel." "Then we bid farewell to our brethren." Both men placed fingers to their lips, and their shrill bird calls pierced the silence and echoed against the neighboring stone walls. A faint whistle was heard in return. The men above had finished emptying the cart of its rocky ballast. They shouldered the now useless cart forward. Samuel pulled Aaron back into the safety of the cave, watching the cascade of sand and rocks fly past the entrance as the cart somersaulted down the cliff. In a flash, it disappeared into the wreckage of rocks below, where it exploded into many pieces. The wind must have carried the sound elsewhere, for they heard nothing. On the plain above, Joshua and his men used brush to erase any tracks that could give away the position of the 2 men huddled in the cave below. Samuel sighed contentedly, while tears slowly trickled down Aaron's dusty cheeks. Aaron's voice cracked. "Our task is nearly finished." Samuel's reply was a whisper. "Yes, Lord Jehovah's work must be done." His heart heavy, Aaron nodded slowly in agreement, although regrets remained. He had just recently married, and the image of his wife's face seemed to linger longer than he wished. Both men retreated to the gooey pile of mud. In the thin moonlight, Samuel laid a layer of mud upon the rock floor at the entrance, while Aaron placed rocks so expertly that only a little mud was needed to fill the joint. Aaron was a mason by trade, and thus by virtue of his craft was called to this critical task. Over the next 3 hours, the two men constructed a substantial rock wall at the cave's entrance. They left a small air funnel at the top. Through this hole, they saw the darkness outside had turned to grayness. Morning was approaching. From the bowels of the earth, God heard Samuel's prayer. "Mighty Jehovah, our duty to thee is now complete. For the sake of Judea and this holy people, this sanctuary is now dedicated to thee as thy holy abode. By thy will, may these weapons remain bright and sharp for that day when they shall be needed to destroy thy enemy. And may thy angels stand as sentinels to protect thy word until thou comest." Samuel paused before concluding with a loud "Amen." He looked at the black shadow across from him. "We now wait for the coming of the Messiah. He shall fight our battles and free us from the yoke of Rome." Aaron nodded slowly. "May he come soon." "So be the will of God," replied Samuel, as if reciting a benediction. 7 days later, Aaron died. Half-starved and maddened by thirst, Samuel lingered, still hoping for the coming of his Messiah.
You're listening to Big World Network.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.